So we'll get started as people are still filing in here. It's just 1 o'clock. My name's Leo Spagnolo, and I'm the managing partner here at Penmore. And I'd like to welcome everyone to our first virtual education seminar. Penmore is going to be running these seminars on a monthly basis with various topics that hopefully bring some value to our clients and prospects. At the end of this session, we'll introduce our February topics. So we'll give you a little teaser of what's coming up in February. We're excited that over 100 people registered, and we see quite a few still filing in here. Thank you for taking time out of your busy day to join us. We hope that we can provide some great value from today's seminar. Today's seminar, as you all know, is a topic that we are all familiar with and probably have more questions about. Mental wellness in the workplace has always been an important topic, but with the recent events with COVID-19 and the additional pressures that obviously COVID has brought, even more important to our staff and to our companies. So I'd like to welcome and introduce our guest speaker today, Jamie Marcellus. I'll give you a little bit of a profile on Jamie. Jamie is a registered nurse by trade and has a master's in business administration. He brings more than 20 years of progressive management experience from the private and the public healthcare sector to Humanicare, a leading provider of employee health services. Jamie started at Humanicare in 2011 as vice president of corporate services, and in 2014, he assumed the role of president. Jamie's previous roles include a senior operational role with a large international health information provider and with a world-renowned hospital. He has previously served as a board of director for a number of public health providers. So really happy to have Jamie join us and provide you with some information on mental wellness. Before I hand it off to Jamie in his presentation, I'd like to go over a couple housekeeping items. If you have any questions, there is on the bottom of your Zoom screen, there's a Q&A section. If you could just type those questions in once Jamie's done his presentation, we'll try to get to most questions. If we don't get to your question, we will answer the questions and provide a question and answer sheet next week, and we'll email that document out to everybody. So again, I'd like everyone to welcome Jamie.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Leo. Very excited to talk to you about mental wellness, specifically as it relates to what's been happening as of late, but also I think just some general practices and things like that. And hopefully at the end of the presentation, not only you'll learn a little bit more in terms of what mental wellness means, but then also some quick takeaway things that you can apply in your own places of work that can really benefit not only yourselves, but also your team members, colleagues, and those that report to you. The title of the presentation is Mental Health and Wellness During the New Normal. The irony being, I'm not sure that this is normal, just given this is certainly unprecedented in probably all of our lives that are on this call. But nevertheless, you know, there are things that we are finding as employers and employees that we have to adjust our way of thinking to. And so hopefully through the end of this, you'll get some sense of that. Just quickly, I think it's a good spot to level set and describe mental health. You know, when we think about mental health and mental well-being, oftentimes we think about mental health disorders. So those are things like depression, anxiety, maybe even more severe things that typically we don't see in the workplace, like schizophrenia. Nevertheless, that's really only one aspect of what we're talking about. And so, you know, I think that if we reshape our thinking, that there is this sort of set of circumstances of both diagnosed mental illness, those things that we've just described, but then there's a whole aspect of mental well-being. So those are things like stress, you know, response to life events like relationship challenges, grief, pandemics, And so it's really important to not only focus on just the illness aspect of mental wellness, but also to talk about some of those other things. And so, I think this will really frame the context of some of the discussion as we get into some of the specifics around, what has it been like over the last 12 months? What have we been experiencing as we've been working through this pandemic? To bear in mind that it's not only about those things that are diagnosed, although that has seen a pretty significant impact, as evidenced by lots of things that you as employers and employees care about. Things, not only the impact on your employees and colleagues, but also increasing drug use and things like that. I mean, pharmaceutical use, but also drug use. And so diagnosed mental illness is certainly a common thing in our environment. Generally speaking, about 30% of individuals, and there's lots of different statistics that you can look at and parse it in many different ways. In some instances, I hear, 1 in 3, sometimes 50%. The number that we generally use is about 30%. And so 30% of individuals facing some sort of a mental wellness issue in a given year. And again, a subset of that is going to be diagnosed mental illness, things like anxiety, depression. And then there's certainly other things. Addictions is a increasing concern, certainly that we're seeing within society, not only as a result of pandemic, but certainly exacerbated by pandemic as people are isolated, are turning to things to try to assist with what's going on with them, but making the wrong choices. But certainly leading up to, over the last number of years, we've seen increasing use in things like opioids, alcohol, and other types of self-medication and things like that. It's important to understand that there is a continuum of mental health. There are factors that affect individuals and their responses, and there are also things beyond their control. So if we look at that sort of continuum, generally speaking, mental wellness can be considered more in a positive light, and mental illness has that more negative connotation with it. But the point of it is generally speaking, mental illness are things that are beyond our control. So that are things like genetics, sometimes environmental issues, different triggers, developmental issues, cognitive issues, as opposed to mental wellness, which generally speaking are more in our control, although that control certainly waxes and wanes. Physical health, environment, the kinds of support that we get from colleagues, the kinds of support we get from people that are important in our lives, self-esteem, things, again, that we can somewhat control. I know aging is a bit of a place out of that, but aging just refers to the fact that, our journey from an age has an impact in terms of our mental well-being. If you imagine teenagers have a totally different outlook in terms of the world and in terms of what it is meaningful for them versus somebody, maybe mid-career or whatnot. From an organization perspective, when we look at things that drive mental illness, those are things that are behaviors generally that we're trying to move away from the organization. So that's abusive behaviors, psychological demands, and the things that generally push people towards more of mental wellness are use of skills and really setting them up for success. Before I flip to the next slide, it's just important to set the context in terms of what's been happening over the next little while, because the next couple of slides I'm going to really dive into some of what we have seen as a provider of services, and certainly of an organization that provides a lot of support to individuals that are facing mental wellness challenges. It's important to set that standard in terms of the kinds of situations that people are dealing with depending on where they are on the spectrum. this is an important slide to sort of set the stage in view of what we have been dealing with and continue to deal with. And it's interesting because over the year, I've paid attention to the slide, and every time I have a conversation like this, I think we're at different phases. And then, you know, it turns out most recent news, if many of you are in Ontario, you know, for instance, we're now back into a lockdown that was very similar to what was happening just a little bit less than 12 months ago. So this is a slide that shows the experience of an individual relative to a natural disaster. And so there's some theory behind this, but when we apply this to COVID-19 and the pandemic, it has some interesting insights into some of the experience. And if I can relate it as we work through it in terms of what you may have been feeling and what you may have been experiencing, hopefully you'll sort of understand how this can adjust depending on where things are. So if you look on the far left, and I don't know if you can see the cursor, but just circling here, pre-disaster was actually this time last year. So if you remember back to last January, last February, even last December, we were hearing this news coming out of an illness that was presenting itself mainly in China and in Asia. And there was talk about things that we should be worried about, and, you know, we should be paying attention to these things, but largely this was, you know, out of sight, out of mind. We weren't really sure if this was going to impact us. We weren't sure if it was going to be something like bird flu or swine flu of years past, where, you know, there's a lot to be made of it, but it wasn't really impacting us. But needless to say, generally speaking, your mood would have been whatever your mood was at that time, but sort of, we'll call it normal in that moment. And so then what happened is this little dip occurred where all of a sudden things got a little bit real in that early March. And it was less of an impact for us immediately in Canada, but more in terms of the response that we were seeing worldwide. We were seeing, quite frankly, some terrible and horrifying images that were coming out of, you know, places like Italy, places like New York. And so because of that, it sort of causes this dip in individual mood. You know, we'll say anxiety related. You sort of have these concerns of what does it mean to me, and what, you know, what's going to be the impact and things like that. This rising curve that we see in this section here, which is called the heroic phase or community cohesion, rising into community cohesion, was really what we all experienced back in the early part of March, when the province in Ontario and similarly across the country, we sort of entered that first phase of shutdown. People generally, you know, wore masks, behaved appropriately, did the things that they needed to do. Our frontline workers rose to the occasion, went above and beyond. The community got behind them, really supported them. People stayed home when they were required. And so that this is that idea of we were all acting as heroes. You're sort of running on energy. And if you imagine in your workforce, at the time, a lot of manufacturing organizations were retooling to produce things like masks and shields and just different things like that. That's what this is really talking about, where there's this sort of moment of hope that we were all having, that, you know, we're confronting reality, but we're certainly rising to that occasion, and we expect that things are going to pull through. And then April hit, or the end of March. You know, we made it through that first month of what was then the lockdown, and we hit into April, and then it felt like, at least to me personally, and probably many of you, it was just long. It felt like we had been, you know, locked up for weeks and weeks and weeks, even though it had been very short. There was sort of no end of sight. Case counts were continuing to rise, you know, sort of dire warnings were happening. And so that's really that described disillusionment phase. And then an interesting thing happened. So we entered into the summertime, and we had this sort of recovery phase. So if you remember back in June and July, first of all, the weather gets nicer, so our mood rises. We're allowed to go outside. You know, we're under less restrictions. We can't travel and we can't do some of the things that we would normally do, but you know, if you have cottages or if you camp or if you get in the outdoors, you can start to do some of those sorts of things. And at the same time, the health situation was generally improving. It felt like we were moving beyond the situation that was happening. It felt like we were, you know, recovering towards success. And so the summer months were, you know, generally speaking, very positive. We had, from a case perspective in Canada, very, very low numbers, provincially, very, very low numbers. Things are improving. And so then we hit this bounce back phase, which we actually haven't hit, because what happens is if you continue this line out, it can run this wave of timing depending on what's happening. And so in the fall, September, October, we start back into really sliding back down from a recovery standpoint, back into where I think we are now, which is in this sort of disillusionment phase again. You know, we're into this phase of, is this going to be forever? We have a little bit of hope because people are being vaccinated and, you know, we're starting to see some progress and things like that. But at the same time, we're getting this message of things are getting dire and we're concerned. And so if you imagine your employees and, you know, we're in this phase, there's uncertainty of, can businesses continue? And it's sort of this just challenging moment. This is an important definition because this is what many of you and many of your employees are facing, which is anxiety. Anxiety, generally speaking, is a response to when things are beyond your control, when you don't know what is going to be next. And so our brains do this funny thing of starting to make things up. And we generally, because we're all protective people from, you know, way back our ancestors, we generally think of the worst case scenario so that we sort of protect ourselves from it. And so anxiety really builds into that. The reason why I talk about anxiety is because it really mirrors what our experience was. And that chart that I just showed you a minute ago mirrors what the experience was within the employee assistance industry. So for those that don't know on the call, employee assistance is a program that sometimes is included as part of an employee benefit, which really supports the mental well-being of individuals. They can access counseling, they can access different sorts of services from that standpoint. This really talks to what that experience was. And so in January, the dark blue and lighter blue chevrons here are essentially the amount of calls that were happening related to service requests, and then also the amount of services that we were delivering. So that's counseling and support and things like that. So in January, you know, referencing to the slide a few minutes ago, things were generally normal, and so that was a normal time. As we entered into that phase where we were being sent home and there was uncertainty, there was layoffs, there was job loss, things like that, as we would expect, call volume started to increase. People were seeking out more, had more questions. Here's what's interesting. So during that time frame, while people were reaching out, they weren't reaching out for help for things that would be traditional that an employee assistance provider would provide. So things like counseling services. Rather, they had lots of questions about, how do I get set up with CERB? How do I access this program? How do I access that program? And so counterintuitive based on what we all saw in the media in that early part of March and April, definitely people were engaging with services on a more frequent basis than historic, but they weren't actually using the services. It was more question-based. And so on a look back, it becomes really interesting as why is that the case? And so, you know, my hypothesis, our working hypothesis is, if you remember back during that time, government, generally speaking, no matter whether you're red, blue, orange, purple, green, it doesn't really matter. Generally speaking, government, at least in Canada, really pushed for a response. And in some instances, they were really criticized for how easy they made it in terms of getting things like CERB. You know, how easy they made it in terms of wage subsidy and things like that. And so they were criticized for that, but nevertheless, you know, they sort of overexerted. At the same time, they opened phone lines for mental health resources, for different kinds of programs, both provincially and federally. And so, people had lots of choice. And because of that, people generally, I think at that time, felt pretty well supported. The other interesting thing that was happening was those people that were affected by job loss, if they were in a period where they were making, reasonable wages, but maybe not at the top end of the spectrum, CERB generally gave them money that was consistent with what they were having before. And in some instances, actually provided more funds than they were normally used to. And so money does certainly have an impact, and financial well-being has an impact on mental well-being. And so because of that, you saw this change. In June, things started normalizing. So people that were still calling about questions, but the questions started moving to, listen, I might need some help with counseling. How might I go about that? I'm not ready yet. And the reason why people weren't ready yet is, if you imagine we're all stuck at home, finding time to have a private conversation, whether that's through video-based counseling or phone-based counseling, while your spouse or partner or kids are sitting next to you or in the next room, is a really challenging thing. And so we saw lots of signs of people seeking out help, but not necessarily following through with it. By July, summertime again, things were generally great. Things started normalizing out in terms of people who were calling were seeking out services. It was at an increased volume over prior years, but the things that they were seeking out help for were not what I would call on the mental illness side of things, so depression, anxiety. It was more relationship challenges. We saw a tremendous amount of relationship challenges. And so if you imagine, over a 6-month period in the early part of last year, where you're now 24/7 with your significant other, sometimes in a 1-room apartment or 2-room apartment, that becomes a big challenge. And so there has been a number of studies that have been released that saw a significant amount of relationship failure through the early part of the pandemic. Fast forward now to the fall, and this information, I haven't updated it through to January, but October, November, as people were back to normal routines, back to school, and more back to work and things like that, we saw a significant increase in usage, 30% more than in prior years, 30% more than our busiest time ever. In fast forward to the first week of January, January 4th, the return to work after school and all those sort of things, we saw volumes that were 50% higher than the prior year. It normalized out over a little while. January is always a busy time, but needless to say, we've seen this big, massive influx over the last little while. And I expect, given that we're into this, sort of new normal of back into lockdown, that we will see some adjustments, based on where it is before. Really thought it was important to give you some experience and some context in terms of where that is, because I think that really applies to how are your employees' mood, and how do you sort of support with that. But we're going to dive into some more practical things to think about and some things that you can really implement as we go through this. So let's talk about returning to work. I know we just sent everybody home. Everybody's working from home. I'm working in my basement. Because I've got my kids that are at school upstairs and my wife that's working for her job upstairs as well. But let's talk about return to work, because we imagine that eventually we will. Anxiety. Your employees do not know what is going on. They are scared. They're scared about illness. They're scared about job loss. They're scared about, they're uncertain about lots of things. And that is an issue. So we just need to call that out and be cognizant of it. To whatever extent, we're going to give you some strategies in terms of how do you do your best to relieve some of that. You will not be able to completely solve that, because that is an inherent response that I have. You cannot change how I respond to things necessarily. You can just try to influence them in a positive way. From a stress perspective, stress is going to be a challenge for many people. There is going to be financial stress. There is going to be continued job loss by individuals. And so if you have one of your employees who has a spouse who lost their job, that is going to impact that employee. At the same time, from a family perspective, guess what? We're at home with our kids at home. We're now educators. We're having to monitor them much closer. We may have daycare challenges. We may have family members who are unwell. We may have family members who are isolated. We just need to bear in mind that we're not just dealing with the employee. And then lastly, work. There's stress at work. You may be trying to do more with less for your employees, to sort of ride this out, to batten down the hatches, that sort of thing. At the same time, some of the work may be more challenging because there's more restrictions that they have in place, or they may have to run into different tasks and things like that. Or if you're in the manufacturing world, as we emphasized earlier, you may be building different things. And so because of that, there's going to be work-related stress. Reintegration. So anytime you move from isolation, there can be overwhelmingness. The best example that I can give you of this is a personal story of mine. So my wife is a teacher. My wife, just before I met her, she taught in the Arctic for 2 years. She taught in the Arctic, and the village that she taught in was 200, 220 people maximum. Very, very small town. 24-hour darkness at this time of year. So lots of isolation, obviously very cold, lots of snow. And so you end up spending your time between school and home and little much else. And so she describes this feeling that she had when she returned back to Toronto, where she was in a movie theater, which isn't a crazy thing. And imagine being in a movie theater. We haven't been back to one in a while, but she's in a movie theater where there might have been 50 people, but they were sitting relatively close, as you would imagine. And she said just there was this overwhelming sense that like people were close and it was noisy and sort of hypersensitive. And I'm not necessarily saying it's that extreme in this situation, but bear in mind that some people's response will be like that. And so we have to be cognizant that they're going to, people are going to have that overwhelmingness. And then just lastly is all the distractions that we just talked about. Family. So we have to, make sure kids are doing whatever they're doing. We have to, work around schedules with their spouse. If I'm on a Zoom call and, we need to make sure that nobody's coming into rooms and things like that. And so it's just challenging times. We just have to be aware of all those sorts of things. I think the important thing that you need to recognize, and one of the things that we've talked about as a management team in our organization, is this isn't business as usual. It's not. People are dealing with the need to make many, many strange decisions in their life, decisions about safety, decisions about, do I go get groceries or do I have them delivered? And, what is the not only personal expense of that, but what's also the monetary expense of that? It's just not a normal time. So because of that, we need really to be empathetic and understanding. We need to change the productivity expectations, especially now when people are at home. So our team members, our employees are going to be distracted because there are things that are happening in their lives that are out of control. They can't control the fact that their kid is next door and is having a challenge logging on to go to school. And so, they may need to pull away from work and do that. And so I think to whatever extent we can, and I appreciate that as a challenge, especially in what we're trying to accomplish in each of our respective organizations, we have to do our best to adjust our expectations from a productivity standpoint. And then lastly, this is something that we learned very on, which is people are having a challenging time making decisions because decisions are things that are in our control, and we're feeling this loss of control. So we really need to be clear in terms of direction and prioritization, because if we leave it to our employees who are struggling with all of these different kinds of decisions in their life, they may not make the decision that we think is best for it. And so to whatever extent we can, we should be really good about prioritizing. From a strategy perspective, I'll focus on the right side of the screen, which is employers and managers. Communication is absolutely critical. I think the challenge that we have is how do we have communication when this is our way now of communicating? How do we have a sensible meeting when it's really hard to have sort of a good debate when only one person can have the mic. Sorry guys, I have the mic today. So it's really challenging. So we have to come up with ways to really communicate. What we've done organizationally, I think that has been really effective, is we just do informal check-ins throughout the day. You know, we're not a huge organization, but you can apply the same learning to teams. And so the team leader or manager or supervisor of that team can just do these informal check-ins. That's check-in by phone. That's check-in. Video is always good. It forces us to brush our teeth and comb our hair and all those sorts of things, but also forces us to see how that person's doing and, you know, are they managing? And then lastly, we send little text messages and things like that as well, just to see how people are, because it's hard to get a sense for what people are working on when we're not there. The next one's really interesting, which is clarity over compliance. And the idea behind this is we want to be really clear about things. And you know, and it's just that whole notion of focus on being clear about it rather than focus on, you need to follow the directions this way. So I want to be clear about what outcome I'm trying to achieve and the deadline that I have, rather than you need to meet it specifically. Like, give the person leeway to manage whatever they're doing in their normal life to do that. Again, to whatever extent you can, depending on the type of workplace that you have. And role modeling behavior. As managers, I think one of the challenges that we have is it's much easier to run out our day much longer when we're at home. It becomes bleed into our own personal time. First of all, you know, we don't have as many family obligations in the evening time or running kids around to sports and events and you know, social activities and things like that. Personally, we don't have those. We can't travel. We can't do those things. So it becomes easy to work. And by the way, you're in your office because it's the next room over, or it's your laptop, or however that is. And so I think it's really important as managers that we show that we're shutting down and we're not, you know, sending messages at 9 o'clock at night, 10 o'clock at night, and all those sorts of things. So, you know, as best we can. From an employee perspective, you know, it's really important to establish new routines and connect with colleagues and use employee supports. So every single organization has some level of support. It doesn't have to be the things that are on the screen here. It doesn't have to be an EAP program. It doesn't have to be things like cognitive behavior therapy. There are resources within your benefits packages, within your education, all those sorts of things. Whatever resources that you already have in place, ensure that your employees know about them and that they're taking advantage of them. And whenever possible, really try to socialize that. When we're on calls like this, when we're having conversations with employees, yeah, you have to pay attention. Pay attention to not only what they're saying, but how they're saying it, and try to understand, you know, perhaps what's behind that. Asking lots of questions where you're seeing behavior that just isn't consistent with what has been in the past. You're missing things. You know, tell me what's going on. You're not yourself today. You know, trying to express that concern, but in a non-threatening manner. It's certainly a challenge, but it's something that I think really benefits, you know, a good response. Listening, trying to understand, wherever possible, if the person is clearly in need of assistance, get them the help that they can by identifying it. Say, you know what, you should get some help. We have this resource available to you. Point that person in that way, and then give them a little bit of time to try to sort it out themselves and check back in with them. Have you done this? How are you feeling today? I know yesterday was a rough day. How are you doing at the end of the day? Those sorts of things become really important. From a new reality standpoint, in terms of businesses, you need to prioritize, obviously health and safety have to come first, health and safety of both your employees, but also your patrons or your clients, or however you describe them. And then really the business needs to follow that. So meaning safety should always come first, and then, you know, sort through whatever the business needs, build the business needs around that. As we get into returning back to work in a month's time or 2 months' time or whenever that maybe is, we're going to need to adjust to flexible work environments, whether you have policies at work that says you don't have to come into the office or whatever that is, or if you're forcing people to come in because that's just the way that your operation works, you need to give flexibility around travel time, especially for individuals that are using public transit and things like that. There's less public transit because it's safe, you know, they make it safe to do so. So you have to be flexible from that. And then there's things that we're not even thinking about. And Penmore guys and I were having a conversation a little while ago about this, but, you know, imagine if you work in an office tower. I'm not sure where you guys all work, but in an office tower where you have 4,000 employees returning to the broader tower, and there is a 6 bank of elevators. The logistics of getting every single person safely into the workplace, they modeled it out. It takes about 9 hours. So imagine that. I'm not saying that's going to be the way that it is, but we have to be cognizant of, we may have to adjust, you know, that we normally have a meeting at 9 o'clock. We might have to give some flexibility around that. And again, the idea of productivity, fine, we really need to adjust around that. In terms of support, empathizing, and then there's lots of resources available to you. The folks at Penmore would love to talk to you, I believe. I don't want to put words in the mouth, but would love to talk to you about benefits programs and things that you probably already have in place that can support with a lot of these things. This one's a tough one, which is to encourage self-care. Healthy eating, personally, I've found challenge because while we have more time, it feels like we have less time because we're, I think, doing more in terms of the things like supporting our kids' work and that sort of thing, but really focusing on healthy eating, trying to get out, do some exercise and things like that, which I think has been a big challenge for many people because gyms have been closed and all that sort of thing. And then sleep, there is a ton of studies and information of the importance of sleep. And so never overlook that. There's lots of great resources that are out there how to encourage good sleep. And then the last one is a thing that's tough to do, but it's something that we certainly recommend, which is encourage time away from the screen, meaning book time. A challenge that you have with your employees is they're building up these big vacation banks. That's bad for 2 reasons. That's a liability on your business. But second is they're not getting that break that they need that would normally energize and excite them. So you need to encourage them to try to take that time at least to be with family and things like that. I know we're just coming from the holiday season, and so we probably did a little bit of that, but this is going to be something that we're, as this continues to sort of drag on, that we're going to have to continue to encourage, is to try to really encourage people to get away and be creative, which is tough when you sort of can't go anywhere. Just quickly, last slide, this is just a reminder. People move along the spectrum from thriving well, stress, disorder, crisis. We don't want them into crisis. There are things that we can do to try to prevent it. We can't, there's never a perfect solution that's going to prevent any type of crisis. But all of the things that we described earlier in terms of self-care, paying attention, having conversations, you know, putting in some of those behaviors, those become really important in moving the individual from that period of stress to period of well, or even from period of disorder to crisis. If we can focus on keeping people well and focus on de-stressing whenever possible, we're going to set ourselves and ultimately our employees up for success. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over for questions that you may have. We've got about probably 10 or 15 minutes, I think, for questions.
Okay, my name is Bill Zolis. I work at Penmore, and thank you so much, Jamie. Really appreciate all your information. I think there's a lot there that will value, you know, many organizations. As we know, mental health, you know, pretty well affects everybody. I just wanted to remind everybody that we have recorded this session, so if you missed something or you want to forward this on to a colleague, feel free to do so. So that's great. And again, a remind. Sorry,
I was going to say we'll also ensure that you guys have this. We'll send it as a PDF so you can distribute it as well with the questions and things like that.
Perfect, thank you. And we have a couple of questions that we'll ask Jamie, but if there's anybody that has any questions, please put them in the question and answer section. You know, we'd love to hear from you. So Jamie, I've got the first question for you is, from your vantage point, do you feel most employers are supporting their employees with mental health as best as they can, especially during this time? Because we've already talked about all the struggles that are going on.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. I think employers are definitely trying. And and I think that's been a culmination of lots of things. There has been a lot of, I think, discussion in the workplace and in, you know, the HR world and things like that around mental wellness. And then I think there's been things that have been more in society in terms of removing stigma and things like that. And so I think employers are generally trying to do the right kinds of things. The challenge that I think employers have is there's so many different options that are out there, and in different options that get at different parts of mental wellness. And so I think, you know, there's lots of good professional advice that's out there in terms of program design and things that they can be doing. It doesn't always necessarily require an investment of money. It can just require an investment of time to sort of rally behind these things. But I think there is absolutely, because of just the general media awareness, it's in almost every discussion that we have. I mean, we obviously come from within the industry, so we're going to be a bit biased towards it. But I think employers are definitely, you know, having these kinds of conversations and really struggling with how do we, you know, support our employees in a really fiscally responsible manner that does all the right things in terms of you know, providing that kind of support that's required, but again is done so under, you know, it's not an unlimited budget and things like that.
Great, Jamie. John Luke, I see we have a question here that from our audience.
We do. Perfect. Jamie, once again, just like Bill said, I want to reiterate, fantastic job. I love the point where logistical nightmare to get the staff into an office tower in Toronto that could take up to 9 hours for an 8-hour shift. I think that is something that flies over a lot of people's heads. We don't think that deep into the logisticals of getting your staff to come into work. But there's a fantastic question here. With people feeling so overwhelmed, how can we help them take advantage of the products and services and the advice we are providing around tools, self-care, etc.? There continues to be swirl despite leading by example and encouraging their employees.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it goes to what I said earlier, which is communicate, communicate, communicate. And so that's a couple things. One is wherever possible, using things like newsletters, information, and sending that out to group. And you have to balance that because you don't want, you know, people to just sort of ignore it. And so again, typically a benefits provider or things that you probably already have access to have some of that information. And so, you know, they can get that in your hands and help you with that. I think it's also things like training for your managers to ensure that they can have the right kinds of conversation. And while they're having that conversation, remind the employee of whatever resources they may have access to, whether that's a resource specifically within the workplace or resources that are available through, you know, programs through the government. Ontario government, if you're in Ontario, or Alberta government, if you're in Alberta, have given access to different counseling services and things like that at no cost for the individuals. And so I don't think it matters where the person gets the help as long as they're getting the help. But sometimes it requires a little bit of nudge or reminding and trying to pick up on those cues of, you know, potentially what the person's having from a challenge perspective.
Okay, Jamie, can you suggest on how we can ask employees about their mental health well-being? How do we ask employees? I'll just make a quick comment on this, and maybe Jamie, you can add something to it. My understanding is, you know, there's nothing wrong with just asking somebody how they're doing. And that's all you do. You're not going to, you know, get too involved in real personal stuff. And then you got to learn how to zip it up and just listen. And, you know, those are the kind of things that I don't think that's a bad thing to just ask them. Maybe you're noticing something, they're a bit off with something, and just ask them how they're doing. And I don't know, Jamie, if you agree with that.
Yeah, so I mean, that's absolutely the first spot. So the challenge with that is we're in this I guess mentality oftentimes as individuals where our answer is good, fine, right? Yeah. So Bill says to me, "How are you doing today?" And I'm fine. And so, you know, a little bit of persistence sometimes can help with that. I think the really great question that we have found, which sort of pivots that question a little bit, and really in a roundabout way gets at what we're trying to ask, is rephrase it to ask, how do you think your colleague's doing? Because you disarm that question where it's not about them anymore. It's about them thinking about, you know, how do you think Bill's doing? Like, I know I've talked to Bill, like, I'm not really sure. How do you think Bill's doing? And then that person might actually open up, and it is almost a reflection of what, you know, what they're dealing with, by saying, you know, I think I think he's struggling. He's having these challenges. And then that just sparks a dialogue that you can start to break into in different ways, depending on how, you know, what's been said, of like, okay, well, I'm going to talk to Bill, but are you feeling that way? Like, because I'm feeling that way. And so if you can kind of turn it back to yourself or turn it away from the person, then it starts to become, I think, a little bit more of a, the person doesn't have to just say, I'm fine, or I'm good, or whatever it may be. So we've just found those things to kind of work.
Okay, great.
Jamie, that was fantastic. I think it's a great segue into the next question that somebody asked. It's, when you know or you suspect your coworker or one of your employees is having a mental health issue or a crisis or struggling with something, what do you do next? Like, you know it, you suspect it, but you've asked the question, what do you do without your jaw hitting the floor?
I think the best thing is what's the saying? We have 2 ears and 1 mouth, right? So listen twice as much as we talk. So we have to listen. Ask open-ended questions, like, tell me a little bit more about that, but then encourage the individual. So, hey, you know what? Thank you for sharing that with me. You know, I know that was a challenge. I know that can't have been easy. Listen, did you know we have access to this program? It's really easy. I've used it before, even if you haven't. You know, give it so that person can, and try to help them with that. And then I think the really important thing that we always miss is to revisit that. Go back to the person, depending on the severity of the situation, 2 minutes later, an hour later, a day later. Hey, like, you know, I was thinking about you. How are you doing? Like, I know yesterday was really a tough day, or, you know, you shared some information. Like, did you end up connecting with the person? How did it go? You don't have to tell me like all the details. I just want to make sure, you know, I'm concerned about you. And by expressing that empathy, you know, oftentimes we can really get at the crux of it. If we're managers, we have to give also the air and, you know, the time for the individual to, hey, you know what, forget about this task. I think this is really important. I want you to reach out and connect with, you know, counseling service or whatever it may be.
This is a question I've probably asked you many times, Jamie, is somebody's asked here about, you know, kind of the usage of EAP specifically. And, you know, we always hear that in the industry, it's between sort of 10, maybe 12%. And, you know, how can you get it higher? Well, we've all heard about, you know, having a championship champion at your firm, constantly reminding people, you know, whatever other methods you have, whether it's online information, brochures, things. But, you know, even though you said the calls have went up a lot, when I look at the clients we have with the APs, I don't see the usage going up at all. So I think that is a frustration for a lot of people. And, you know, I'm sure you've heard this question many times. How can they help with that?
So I have a few ways to approach it. First and foremost, don't worry about usage. So if you're doing all the right kinds of things as an organization, you have a champion, you're communicating often, you're reminding people, you're making it easy, all those sorts of things. The goal should be to ensure that all of the people who need it have it. And if your organization is a very healthy organization, and that means it's 1% of your workforce that has it, that needs it and is using it, then success. If on the flip side, it's an unhealthy organization and 100% of people need it and 100% of people using it, success. The reality is it's probably somewhere in the middle, which is we know, you know, that there are people who need services who aren't using them. And so we have to have the kinds of conversations that we just talked about a minute ago. We have to train managers and supervisors to be able to be on the lookout for that thing. You know, I think it's going to be unique to each organization. Look to the team members who have the most interaction with their employees, because sometimes they can pick up on things. And if you train them properly, and again, give lots of information, you can drive success from that standpoint. So for instance, in manufacturing, what we have found to be successful is, contrast many manufacturing organizations don't have widespread email that companies, that employees would be using and things like that. So sending out an email message isn't going to work. But training, doing a quick little lunch debrief, giving them some information, that can help. Training the health and safety manager who's walking around paying attention to, how people are responding and, checking in with people, to be on the lookout for different kinds of behaviors. That can actually ensure that people are getting the help that they need. And then the last point is, listen, at the end of it, I always say that we know that we're not reaching 100% of people, and that's always a concern. It's a concern where somebody needs help and they didn't get it. But at the same time, we know that we're also reaching people who needed help, and they're getting the help that they need. And in some instances, that's life-saving. And so I'd say don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, in terms of, it's not doing as well as I want, because in some instances you may be saving the lives of your employees, but rather work with your organization, work with your advisor, work with your EAP company to do some of these things. And the really good ones want to have this conversation. They want to figure out a way of how do you communicate with your employees such that we can leverage that and try to drive this kind of conversation.
Thank you.
Fantastic, Jamie. Another question here. I'm going to put 2 and 2 together from one of the questions, which is more of a comment and then the question itself. Are you seeing a lot of organizations provide blackout periods within the day for wellness, stretching times, say at 11 o'clock in the afternoon, 2 o'clock as a break, or no meetings during lunch periods, etc.? As we understand that the workload's not going away. So if we integrate an hour blackout period here and there, and you say you put 2 in a day, you still have to catch that up later on in the evening, which takes away from family time, personal time, and relaxation time.
It's a brilliant idea. So I'm not seeing it on a widespread basis. Certainly there's some organizations that we've run into or had conversations with that we're encouraging that are doing that, and I think they're actually seeing lots of good benefit, because it forces the things that we described earlier in the presentation, which is it forces a bit of that self-care time. It forces the person to sort of step away from the screen and take a little bit of me time so that I can sort of readjust and move forward. And so, like, brilliant idea. It's a great, if you can implement that in your organization and appreciate that not every organization is going to be able to do something like that. But to whatever extent you can, wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. The other thing that I think we did early on, which, and I think lots of organizations have done, and it's a fine balance, is that idea of, the Friday afternoon sort of social Zoom. The challenge I think that we all find is it's just become we're Zoom everything. And so you certainly have to balance some of that. But again, trying to insert a little bit of, to whatever extent we can, sort of normalcy, because normally, in workplaces, it's highly collaborative. You can walk down to, the next cubicle or the next office and sit down and have a chat. And Friday afternoons are, a little bit more easygoing oftentimes. And so trying to, again, you're sort of over-forcing that, like creating a structure in something that normally wouldn't structure, but I think it's almost necessary. And so I think that's a great idea to that question asker.
Perfect. We're wrapping up, getting close to that 2 o'clock period. So we'll let Bill ask one more question, and then we'll get into the closing section of it.
Yeah, Jamie, somebody wrote a very short question, but I think I know what they mean. So as much as we talk about employers should have a little bit more leeway during this time with productivity, one of the comments was the workload is not going away, ... Now, I know there's a lot of challenges in a lot of employers where, if somebody leaves or, the work's still there, they're not replacing anybody and they're just throwing it on the people that are already there. So These are challenges. I know you spoke about it a bit earlier where maybe some of the employers are going to have a little bit more, sort of leeway. So I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, that's obviously a really tough one. I agree that the workload's not going away. And in fact, in some instances, as I said, it's getting actually more challenging because if, maybe if you're a task-driven organization, those tasks are taking longer, either because of physical issues like we have to, wash our hands 2 times after, whereas before it was only 1 time, or whatever it is. I'm obviously making it up, but those sorts of things create issues of productivity. And then secondly, just both mood and everything else that we're dealing with. To whatever extent you can, you have to try to be patient with it, because, and it is a tough balance, I appreciate, because the more sort of we put off or that we don't address, it just compounds. But that's where it's moved back into some expectations and things like that. I think as we're all trying to be heroes and sort of working through this and all those sorts of things, but we also have to recognize that our customers are in the exact same boat as us. So, I think it's okay when the dog barks behind on the call and stuff like that. And I know that's not specifically what you're asking, but it's more around having a normal dialogue with your customers, I think is actually an okay thing. I think it's a vulnerable time, and if we can be a little bit more vulnerable to our clients, I think you'll hear that there's a lot more tolerance for some leeway in terms of deadlines and things like that. Again, it's not a perfect solution, but I think just by obviously you attending this event and trying to get some information and things like that, we're all taking that step in the right direction. These are the things, this is the conversation that management teams are having, which is how do we support, how do we ensure our employees continue to be engaged when they're now in, on screens instead of in offices and cubicles and whatever it may be. So, I just, my advice is continue the conversation. That's the best thing that you can do.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So just want to let everyone know there are a couple questions that were unanswered. What we're going to be doing is going to be providing the video to everybody through a link after this conference, as well as any unanswered questions. Jamie's going to respond to those in writing, just so everybody has the answers in front of them. And if there are any other questions that you may think of over the weekend or until our next conference, feel free to reach out to one of the Penmore members, the account executives, Leo Spagnolo, or directly at Jamie. Thank you very much for your time, Jamie, and I'll pass this off to Rahim.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rahim Pira. I run Penmore's group retirement business. First and foremost, Jamie, terrific presentation. I think a lot of value add there for all our clients and partners. So for the February 12th session, we're very excited to have Francis Donald, who is the Managing Director and Chief Economist for Manulife Financial, a truly dynamic speaker. This will be a different sort of a format. It will be more of a fireside chat where we'll have a conversation with Leo and Francis. She is a terrific conversationalist. I'm very excited for this session. We had a terrific turnout today, about 130 people. So we are really hoping that you will come back for this special event. So we're very excited for that. I'll hand it over now to Leo to provide some closing comments. I think Leo is trying to find his unmute button.
Had to find the mute button here out of several screens. Yeah, just want to thank everyone. Thank Jamie again for the insightful presentation, and hopefully everyone can take a little bit of value out of this presentation and apply it in their organizations. So again, thanks everyone, and have a wonderful weekend.